my Supernatural family, it's me, Chris, and welcome back to the Supernatural Room, the place where Supernatural fans come together to listen to some good old-fashioned fanfic. Excuse me. I'm a little under the weather today, so if I sound a little bit stuffed up or I cough, please forgive me. Whew. I want to share our story this week. It is called As He Breaks, and it is by Winchester and Winchester, and is found on fanfiction.com. I do have permission to read the story, and as always, the link is down below. I do want to give out a trigger warning, possible trigger warning, on this week's story. It does take place in hell, and is between Dean and Alistair. So, you want to let you know so that you can choose whether or not you continue on with this video. Here we go. Dean's wrists were badly chafed. He suspected his ankles looked the same, if not worse. He wasn't sure why he bothered fighting against the chains that held him to the rack, just loosely enough to allow for some struggle, but never enough to actually do any good. It had been weeks, months, years, maybe even decades. But still, he couldn't help himself. He had to fight against the pain. It was as natural a reaction as squinting after stepping into direct sunlight. How long had it been since he'd seen that? Somehow, that felt even longer ago. He kept count for the first year. He would whisper it under his breath at the end of each day, at the end of each session. When Alistair laid his razor down on the table of instruments he kept close. Dean would grit his teeth, and through the blood in his mouth, groan out the number. The last he recalled saying was 368. On day 369, he couldn't remember what yesterday was. Every day contained the same thing, so he was surprised he kept track as long as he did. 369, Alistair said when Dean didn't. His voice was unnaturally sympathetic. That startled Dean more than what he said. It's day 369, Dean. He sobbed that day. Not that he hadn't cried before here, but this time it wasn't because of the pain. Not totally, at least. Hearing his name said softly, almost kindly, broke his heart completely. How long ago had that been? Dean wondered. Day 369 became 370, and then it was 400. And then he gave up keeping track, when he realized that he had started counting because he believed it would end one day. But it wouldn't. This torture, this excruciating pain, it would never end. On whatever day it was this time, Alistair glanced at Dean, returning from cleaning his blade on an already blood-soaked towel nearby. Dean's jaw clenched tightly, the only pain he could control, and his eyes shut. His hands balled into fists, and he tensed, knowing exactly what was coming. The day was nearly over. He never knew how he knew, but somehow he just did. So Alistair was cramming in what he wanted to finish before time was up. The razor cut into the flesh, just below his rib cage. And though he tried to keep silent, Dean cried out until his throat was raw, or at least more raw than it had been at the start of the day. Water, or better yet, whiskey, was unheard of down here. He knew screaming was just as useless as fighting, but he was powerless to stop either. No one would help. No one seemed able to hear, except Alistair. Not that Alistair was the only one who took pleasure in Dean's agony. Others came, some demon, some human on their way to becoming demons. But today, it was just Alistair. Finally, the master of torture stepped back, tilted his head, and smiled. He was hideous in every way, his unvesseled form. But his smile made the ugly, evil face even harder to look at. Dean refused to open his eyes, instead hearing the smile in Alistair's voice when he stated, "There. I think that's quite enough for one day, wouldn't you agree?" Then, the same sounds he heard every night since he awoke here, suspended and chained in the abyss. The familiar metal-on-metal tick of the razor being placed on the table. A few footsteps, scribbling, Alistair's notebook closing. More footsteps, nearing this time. Dean knew what the demon would say next, and he knew what he had to say. But yesterday, something had changed. He felt his strength waning. Not that he had any left, but his reserves, the ones buried way down deep, were failing him. Years upon years of this had stripped away every ounce of resolve he had. And yesterday, when Alistair offered to take him off the rack, Dean hadn't replied. It was the first time that he couldn't find the will to say no, or one of the many other sarcastic responses he had come up with. Instead, his silence spoke for him, and Alistair returned the next morning with his tools and evil smile. Dean couldn't open his eyes if he wanted to look at the figure hovering over him, taking stock of the damage the demon had inflicted. Dean couldn't recall ever being so exhausted. He had endured so much pain. He was at his breaking point. "Did you know it's our anniversary today, Dean?" Alistair asked, his voice just above a whisper. Dean could barely breathe, his body torn to shreds. But he fought to focus on the words. What could it be? 5 years, 10, 20. I know you wanted to get me something special to celebrate, but you've been just so darn tied up lately. He laughed. Dean cringed. Don't worry, I got you something special. Alistair leaned in even closer as Dean angled his head as far away as he could manage. I was thinking tomorrow we could get a dog. Tears burned behind his closed lid, and one escaped down his bruised cheek. His fists ached, but he couldn't release them. He imagined breaking these chains and what? There was no getting out or getting back to Earth. And Dean knew what kind of dog Alistair was referring to. A hellhound. It wasn't the first time Alistair had let that beast at Dean, but it had been a while. That was one thing Dean was thankful for. Oh, bother, I shouldn't have told you. Now you're so excited you won't be able to sleep, Alistair teased, straightening. Unless, of course, you don't want to. He almost sang the words. You know, if you wanted to get out of here, we could go somewhere nice to celebrate. There it was. The offer. Cruelly disguised as freedom. But it was there all the same. Get off the rack and take Alistair's place. Stop being the victim and start on his path to becoming a demon. Alistair waited patiently. Moments passed, and Dean said nothing. He couldn't speak. He wanted to decline, scream it, shout it, spit it, but nothing came out. All right, Alistair finally replied, an odd mix of pleasure and disappointment in his tone. Then I will see you bright and early tomorrow. How long? Dean didn't recognize his own voice, but he knew from the grating in his throat that he had managed to speak. I beg your pardon? Dean swallowed painfully. How long? He forced his eyes open and tried to look Alistair square in the face. The demon smiled. How long have we been together? Why, Dean, I'm hurt. I thought you were keeping count this whole time. He waited, expecting a snippy reply, but Dean had nothing to say. Sighing, Alistair replied, 30 years. Dean could have fainted. If it was Earth and the natural rules applied, he would have. 30 years. To some extent, he couldn't believe it had been so long, but he was equally shocked that so little time had passed. It felt like an eternity already. How could he possibly endure more? Much less more without end. His thoughts shifted to Sam, the only comfort he found here. Was he happy now? If 30 years had passed, Dean could believe that Sammy had moved on and had been able to forget about him. He'd be over 50 now. Dean almost smiled at the mental image of his brother with thinning hair and no, Sam isn't an old man now. Dean froze. You see, Dean, time's different down here. Oh, yes, it's been 30 years here, but it's only been 3 months up there. That statement, whether true or false, burned the last atom of strength Dean had left. He couldn't fight any more. He had fought for 30 years, 3 decades to the day, and he couldn't take it any longer. Well, I'll just be going now. Knowing the satisfaction it would give Alistair almost made Dean keep quiet. But he also knew what would come tomorrow if he didn't. Wait. Alistair stopped at the door, his hand on the rusty knob. He didn't look back. Yes, Dean. Something you need? Dean closed his eyes against the spinning room. His heart slammed against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He was giving up his body, maybe his soul, hated for it. I'll do it. The footsteps approached again. I might have had some blood in my ear, Dean, so could you repeat that? I want to get it just right for my diary. I said, I'll do it. His voice was still unrecognizable to him. It was weak, unsteady, raw, just like the rest of him. It suited the victimized, abused man he'd become. Then suddenly, he was that man no longer. His hands relaxed, and the agonizing tension in every muscle eased. This had happened 1,000,000 times before, but this time, the healing felt different. He felt like himself again, powerful and capable, young and alive. The chains fell open as Alistair snapped his finger for the first time in 30 years. Dean was free from bondage. He sat up slowly, cautiously. He felt sure that this was a trick, that the chains would close again around his limbs and he would be stuck again, left to contemplate his absolute aloneness until Alistair returned. But it didn't happen. He swung his legs over the side of the cold metal rack, and his torturer stepped back, giving Dean space. Dean couldn't shake the unease he felt as Alistair watched him, like Alistair was a starved monster, and Dean was his lunch. Even though he was whole again, uncut, unbloodied, Dean's legs were not what they once were, and his knees buckled when his feet touched the floor, and his weight shifted. He held on to the rack and cursed. Alistair abruptly walked to the other side of the room to a cabinet that Dean had never seen open. Swinging it open and revealing at least a dozen bottles of liquor, Alistair glanced back. Can I interest you in a drink to celebrate this momentous occasion? Dean's mouth watered, and his stomach growled at the sight. He was proof that food and drink wasn't a necessity to survive in hell. He hadn't eaten since his last meal at Bobby's house, but he still craved it. Alistair selected one and moved to the door. He opened it and called, "Bring her in." Dean watched in shock as two demons dragged a woman in, wailing and begging. Dean moved away from the rack in horror as she was strapped into the space he had filled for the past decades. She too fought against the restraints, uselessly, crying, her eyes darting around the room. She was as panicked as he had been his first day in this God-forsaken room. Dean turned away from the sight, covering his face with a shaking hand. He knew what was expected of him, what his end of the bargain was for the woman taking his place. But he had spent his whole life helping people, saving them from monsters. Would he really become the monster now to spare himself? "Oh, Dean," Alistair sang above the woman's shrieks. Dean, slowly, almost against his will, looked at the demon. Alistair held out the bottle of liquor, but Dean wasn't aware of what Alistair was really offering him. His free hand rested over his razor, and he tapped his fingers impatiently on its handle. "Come on, Grasshopper. It's time to get started." Resisting the urge to vomit, if that was even possible in hell, Dean yanked the bottle from Alistair's hand, broke the seal, and drank it greedily. He could barely stop. He needed air. Lowering it, he inhaled deeply, gruffly. Perhaps this was when the real torture began, he considered. Maybe there was a way to get free to... Suddenly, Alistair was directly beside him, his hands tight against Dean's throat. "I know what you're thinking, Dean. And before you think in a moment longer, I want you to know that if you don't pick up that blade and do exactly as I tell you, you will spend the rest of your days on this rack without another offer. And don't forget, the rest of your days is really just a figure of speech. You understand me?" Dean understood perfectly. This was his only chance to be free of an eternity of suffering. He nodded once. Alistair released him and moved away, close to the woman. "Hello, my dear," he swooned. "You are in for a real treat. I mean, a real treat. You see this man? Oh, he's really something special, dear. You might even say he's a virgin, and you're going to be his first. Yes, this is going into my diary for certain. Now come on, Dean. Let's not waste the lovely girl's time. Can't you see she's ready and waiting?" Dean finished the bottle, slamming it down. He heard the woman cry out in surprise at the noise before continuing to sob, begging Alistair to let her go. Dean wished he was deaf and blind. With a trembling hand, he gripped the blade and turned. She eyed the razor and screamed out even louder than before. Alistair grinned. "That's right. Come here now." Dean didn't remember much of what happened next. He listened to Alistair's instructions. Where to cut, how to cut, what places on the body produced the most and least amount of blood, and so on. To Dean's disgust, Alistair was teaching him. Something in Dean's mind switched off that day. And it was at that exact moment that Alistair's blade, held tightly in Dean's own hand, sliced through the woman's skin, drawing the most fear-filled cry he had ever heard. But she wasn't afraid of Alistair. She was afraid of Dean. To protect himself, he imagined, it was as though his humanity turned away, and all that was left was the wounded animal who finally, after 30 years, had the chance to inflict pain back. He couldn't hurt Alistair, but he could imagine that every soul placed before him was the demon. And instead of counting the days, Dean began counting souls until he lost count of those too. Whew. Wow. I literally have goosebumps right now. That was intense. I like the part that stood out to me the most, or one that stood out, was when Dean took the bottle and broke the seal, being that he's the one who broke the first seal in hell by accepting the deal. And wow, just to hear the torture he went through, the pain he went through, and being in a place where he felt like there was no other choice, that he just could not take anymore, that it just needed to stop. It is something I'm sure we can all relate to. With that being said, down below I did put our I'm Alive helpline information. If you ever are in that headspace, give them a call. It's free, it's anonymous, it's totally done through texting, and they can help. Good people there, good people in this family. We can reach out to all of us. Don't let the demons break you. Because in the supernatural family, you're never alone. Because we love your beautiful, crazy faces. So always keep fighting. Love you. See you next week. Bye.